In this review, we will test the new Coros Pace 3, the successor to what's probably the most popular watch that Coros has made so far, the Pace 2. In this video, we will focus on systematically testing the heart rate tracking performance, GPS tracking accuracy, and we will also take a look at the sleep stage tracking performance, so you can decide if the Coros Pace 3 is the watch for you. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised by the performance of this lightweight and relatively affordable watch from Coros. Let's get started. Hello everyone, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now, as I mentioned, in this video we will be doing systematic tests on the Pace 3, but first some disclosures. Coros sent me this watch for testing, but it will go back to them after I'm done, and they did not have any input or influence on this video. I aim to give you independent testing, and I've never been sponsored by a company producing any device reviewed. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. Now, as you know, I don't like diving too much into the specs of watches, but given that I get to release this video the moment the Pace 3 is announced, I'm going to make an exception and try to summarize the most important features and how they compare to the Pace 2 in about 180 seconds. Let's get started with the design. The Pace 3 is marketed as a very lightweight watch weighing 30 grams with a nylon band and 38 grams with a silicone band. This means it is indeed very lightweight, but still about a gram heavier than the previous Pace 2, which weighs in at 29 and 36 grams for the nylon and silicone band variants respectively. The bandwidth of the Pace 3 is also 2mm wider at 22mm compared to the Pace 2's 20mm. But these are of course relatively small details. A bigger change is actually the addition of a touchscreen on the Pace 3, which was not part of the Pace 2. The 1.2-inch touchscreen display includes an always-on mode and a night mode, but what is far more important to me is the sensor set. The Pace 3 includes the next-gen heart rate sensor with 5 LEDs and 4 photodetectors, while still having a slightly reduced casing size compared to the Pace 2. It now also includes an SpO2 sensor for blood oxygen tracking, which the Pace 2 did not have, and importantly to me, the satellite chipset was also changed. The Pace 3 supports all 5 satellite systems, but the major improvement is that the Pace 3 now supports L1 and L5 dual frequency, while the Pace 2 didn't. Just to very briefly explain what that means, L1 is more or less the standard frequency used by most smartwatches. However, this single frequency data could be affected by atmospheric disturbances, for instance, leading to inaccuracies in the end. The ability of the Pace 3 to now also use the L5 frequency means it has access to additional satellite signals that help correct the inaccuracies stemming from the atmospheric effects on the L1 signals. In essence, using 2 frequencies should reduce the error rate, but of course we're going to put this to the test. In terms of connectivity, both the Pace 3 and Pace 2 sync data through Bluetooth, but the Pace 3 also offers Wi-Fi connectivity and it supports Bluetooth Low Energy, which wasn't part of the previous model. It now also comes with a built-in 4GB of storage space and the option of connecting Bluetooth headphones to play music. However, the Pace 2 supports N+, which the Pace 3 does not. Now, these changes might be responsible for the increased battery life of the Pace 3, in addition to also just having a bigger battery capacity, with the Pace 3 sporting a 236 mAh battery compared to the prior 220 mAh. Now, the Pace 3's battery life is actually really good and it lasts for 24 days in standard use or for 18 days with sleep tracking active. When standard GPS is used, it should last you about 38 hours during an activity. If you turn on all systems, so all satellite systems simultaneously, that drops to about 25 hours. And if in addition you turn on dual frequency, that drops down even further to 15 hours. Still, if true, this is very good. Now, it seems to be more or less standard in the smartwatch world. Pace 3 has water resistance up to 5 atmospheres, and it also has some additional sensors we didn't discuss yet, like a barometric altimeter, compass, gyroscope, and thermometer. Now, to close off, let's talk about the price, which will be the deciding factor for many. I would say that this is pretty competitive at $229 US, 249 euros, or 219 British pounds. Okay, that's a lot more information than I normally provide, but let's get to the thing that most of you have been waiting for, the actual testing, and let's start off by looking at the heart rate tracking performance of the Coros Pace 3, which I tested during a total of 4 indoor cycling workouts, 12 outdoor cycling workouts, 2 outdoor runs, and 3 weightlifting sessions. Now, to test that, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the Pace 3 against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. And we will start by looking at one of the easiest types of exercises for a watch to track, cycling indoors. And I'll be looking at a total of 4 interval spinning sessions. Now this generally involves very little movement or tension on my arm and will therefore produce less noise. And here you can see an overview of that accuracy over all the rides. Now each dot here is a single heart rate measurement, with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the Coros Pace 3. Now the closer the points are to this blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots that there are. Now overall, as you can see, the agreement with the ECG chest strap is pretty good. There's a lot of dark black here close to the blue line. Now there are still some points away from the blue line, both below it, meaning it detected a too low heart rate in these moments, and also a bit above it where it detected a too high heart rate. But overall it looks pretty good, and we can also see that this R value, or the correlation, is pretty good at 0.94. This correlation cannot be higher than 1, so a value of 0.94 is pretty good. However, let's take a look at some of the individual training sessions, because we still need to explain why sometimes it detected a too low and sometimes a too high heart rate. And here you can see the first example interval spinning session, where we see a very good agreement between the Coros Pace 3 and the ECG chest strap. Now along the horizontal axis we have the time, and my heart rate is along the vertical axis. In blue-green I plotted my heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red I plotted my heart rate according to the Pace 3. And for this ride we see more or less perfect agreement, though there were a few moments where there was some slight deviation in it picking up a change in my heart rate. So you can see in the beginning it needed a bit of time to catch up to my real heart rate, but this is understandable. But later on there were 2 moments, so right here and right here, where there was a tiny delay in it picking up a change in my heart rate. So here I had a decrease in my heart rate, and here it struggled just a little bit. And also right here, and potentially even right here, there was a small delay in it picking up an increase in my heart rate. But overall, this doesn't look bad at all. These are really minor differences. And for this second spinning session, we see more or less the same thing. There was one moment right here where I did struggle to pick up on that decrease in my heart rate. So it picked up on the first bit of decrease, but after that it kept detecting a too high heart rate for a while, and it never fully reached a dip in my heart rate. For the other sections it generally looks quite good, though we can also see right here and right here that there were some delays in picking up that decrease, and it never fully detected the dip in my heart rate. But probably these small differences aren't that important, only right here do I really see an issue. Still, as I said, generally this looks quite good. And that's also what we see for this spinning session right here, where there's really quite a good agreement between the Coros Pace 3 in red and the Polar H10 in blue. Only one moment right here that the Pace 3 struggle a bit, but overall I'm very satisfied with the performance of the Pace 3 during indoor cycling. Alright, that's looking pretty okay so far. However, to get a better understanding of how the Pace 3 performs, let's put these results into context by comparing them against 70 different watches I've previously tested. This way you can determine if there's possibly a better watch out there for you. And that overview is displayed right here. Now the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric we will use for this, which is displayed along the horizontal axis. We want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. And on the vertical axis I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And I marked the Coros Pace 3 in red right here. And as you can see, it's sort of in the upper middle class of watches. It's not amongst the absolute best, but it's likely doing good enough. And we can also see the Coros verdicts right here, which is doing significantly worse on me than the Pace 3, though I have to admit I did test the verdicts a while ago with a different firmware version, so it might have improved over time. But let's zoom in a bit so we can read the labels more clearly. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here, where I just have the watches with a correlation of 0.90 or higher, so only the better performing watches. And as you can see, the Pace 3 is doing quite well. It's doing about the same as the Whoopstrap 4.0 for instance, but also the recently released Coros heart rate monitor, so a separate device just for heart rate tracking. So that's quite impressive. Now it's not as good as some of the newer Garmin watches right here, and it's especially still a bit worse than some selected Huawei watches like the GT 3 Pro, and as people that watched more of my videos will know, Apple watches are just the best heart rate trackers out there, at least on me, and it doesn't seem like any watch is coming close. Still, I'm quite happy with the performance of the Pace 3, and for me it would be good enough to track my heart rate during indoor cycling. However, let's now look at a more difficult exercise for a watch to track, cycling outside. Now, cycling outside increases the tension on my arms because I have to hold on to the handlebars, and there's also much more movement and bumpiness, making it much harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. I tested the Coros Pace 3 for a total of 12 bike rides, and the Pace 3 actually excelled compared to other watches. And an overview of that is displayed right here. So this is a similar overview to before. And again, we want the points to be as close to this blue line as possible. And luckily, we again see there's many points here close to the blue line. So that looks pretty good. There are a few more points away from the blue line now, both below it and above it, but I would say especially below it, there's quite a few points, meaning that in these moments it detected a too low heart rate. The correlation value is now 0.85, and for cycling outdoors, this is actually pretty good. Most watches struggle a lot with cycling outdoors, and the difference in performance between cycling indoors and outdoors is usually pretty big. However, for the Coros Pace 3, it's actually not that bad. So we went from 0.94 to now 0.85. So that's not a huge difference, and it's looking pretty good. However, again, we do need to look at those individual training sessions to see why sometimes it detects it too low and also every once in a while too high heart rate. And here we have the first example bike ride, again with the reference in blue-green and the Pace 3 in red. And as you can see, overall the agreement is actually quite good. The Pace 3 was able to pick up on most of the peaks and dips in my heart rate quite accurately, and a lot of watches struggle with this. A few of the details are lost, so right here, for instance, some quick peaks in my heart rate were not detected. The same goes for this dip in heart rate and some of the dips right here, but still overall this looks quite good. Now for this second bike ride it struggled a bit more, so you can see for instance right here it didn't fully pick up on this dip in my heart rate, and at the end right here it failed to pick up on some of the peaks in my heart rate, meaning it detected a too low heart rate in these moments. But overall this isn't that bad compared to many other watches. And if you look at all the bike rides, we see that it generally performs quite good, though definitely not perfect. So you can see right here that it really follows along well with the reference device. Now for this bike ride, it struggled a bit more, for instance, right here and right here. And one or two bike rides really were a bit worse, like this one right here, for instance, where it had quite a bit of deviation in the beginning of the ride. Still, generally the Pace 3 seems quite good for cycling outside, at least compared to the competition. There's a few better watches out there, which I'll show you now by comparing the Pace 3 against many of the other smartwatches I tested in the past. Where again, the more to the top right, the better the performance of the watch compared to the ECG chest strap. And I marked the Coros Pace 3 in red. And as you can see, it's among some of the better watches out there. Interestingly, it's again very close to the dedicated Coros heart rate monitor, and it's doing about the same as the Garmin Instinct 2 and Garmin Forerunner 255, which could be some of the competitors for the Pace 3, especially the Forerunner 255. So it's good to see that the Pace 3 seems to be doing as well, or maybe even a little bit better than the Forerunner 255, at least on me. Now, as you can see, there are still some devices out there that are clearly outperforming the Pace 3, like some selected Huawei watches again, and also some Apple watches. So also for cycling outside, at least on me, Apple watches are by far the best, but I do suspect that if the performance of the Pace 3 on me translates to other people as well, that this performance will be good enough for most people. Next, let's take a look at an exercise which is probably one of the main use cases of the Pace 3, namely running. Now, I'm not a very consistent runner, and lately I've been having some knee issues, but I still managed to get 2 short interval runs in, and these results are actually really interesting. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. And of course, you would also make me really happy and it would help my efforts if you subscribe to this YouTube channel. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance during running. And here we have an overview of the performance during running, and as you can see, this looks really good. The correlation is now 0.98, so really high, and most points are along the blue line. Now we do have fewer samples here since I only did 2 short runs, but overall this looks really good, and I also made sure to do intervals so we would have both high and low heart rate values to see if it can cope with those fast changes. But again, let's take a look at those individual training sessions to see if there were any minor deviations. And here you can see the first short interval run that I did. And as you can see, the Pace 3 in red really followed along well with the chest strap in blue-green. There were a few moments with a tiny bit of deviation, as you can see right here, for instance, and right here. But generally, after it caught on to my heart rate, it was super accurate for this run. So I'm quite satisfied with the performance. And for this second run, we generally see the same thing. So it really follows along nicely with my heart rate. Only right here did it detect a small peak in my heart rate that was likely not there. But still overall, the agreement between the Pace 3 and the chest strap is really good. So based on my admittedly somewhat limited testing for running, the Pace 3 does seem to be doing quite well for running outside. Next, let's take a look at another difficult exercise for a watch to track: weightlifting. Now, for weightlifting, it's not the movement per se that makes it difficult to track your heart rate, but this exercise is more difficult because of the increased tension on my wrist and my arm, making it much harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. And here you can see an overview for weightlifting, which I tested during a total of 3 upper body weightlifting sessions. And as you can see, this is the only exercise where the Pace 3 really performed quite poorly. The correlation is really low at 0.6, so it can be 1 maximum, so 0.6 isn't that good. And we can see quite a few points away from the blue line. Now in the lower heart rate range it seems okay, but especially as my heart rate goes up, the Pace 3 tends to detect a too low heart rate, as you can see because of this cloud of points right here. And this is what we see for many watches. The moment I start a set of exercises, my heart rate increases, but also the tension on my arm really increases a lot, and a watch isn't able to detect my heart rate accurately because of that tension, and it keeps detecting the low heart rate I had before the set. And this also seems to be what's happening with the Pace 3. But let's take a look at some of the individual training sessions to see if this is indeed the case. And we can very clearly see what the issue is during this first weightlifting session I wanted to show you. So in blue-green you can see the peaks of my heart rate I had during each set, and as you can see the Pace 3 in red just cannot detect my peaks in my heart rate, and this was the most clear example I had. If we look at some of the other weightlifting sessions like this one right here, we generally see the same problem, though a few times the Pace 3 was able to pick up on some of the peaks in my heart rate. So it wasn't the total loss, but still I don't get the impression you should rely on the Pace 3 for weightlifting. So this is the only exercise so far where it really struggled. And comparing the Pace 3 to other smartwatches, we see it's not doing that great. It's really amongst the lower end of smartwatches when it comes to tracking my heart rate during weightlifting. Basically like 85% of watches is doing better than the Pace 3. But the question is how many of you would actually want to use the Pace 3 for weightlifting? And in addition, most smartwatches just aren't good enough for weightlifting. So even some of the watches that are a bit higher up, I wouldn't recommend for use during weightlifting. Only watches with a correlation of 0.9, preferably 0.95 or higher, are decent enough for tracking your heart rate during weightlifting. My general recommendation is to use an ECG chest strap for weightlifting. This is the only way to systematically get good heart rate readings during weightlifting. Overall, the heart rate tracking performance of the Pace 3 is quite good, and it outperforms quite a few watches out there. I would say it's pretty good during indoor cycling and also good for outdoor cycling, especially compared to other watches. And it also did not disappoint me while running. Only during weightlifting did it really struggle, and for this use case it's really amongst the worst watches, though I suspect that for the target audience of the Pace 3 they will not care too much about that. Therefore overall I'd give the heart rate tracking 4 or maybe even 4.25 out of 5 stars. Next, let's take a look at a feature that is generally dominated by Garmin, namely the GPS or location tracking. But let's see if in this case Coros can take them on with the Pace 3. Now I used all systems and dual frequency on the Pace 3 for this testing, which basically means it can use any satellite system available at 2 frequencies to theoretically at least get the best accuracy. Now the way we will actually test the location tracking is by cycling the same route several times and then checking if the signals overlap, which would be a good thing, or if there's a big divergence between the recorded signals, which would be bad. Now I tested the Pace 3 while I was cycling to and from work, and here you can see the results for 5 times I cycled to work. Now the green markers indicate the moment that the watch connected a satellite signal, and I didn't give the watch any extra time to acquire the signal, and I always started my ride on this corner right here. And as you can see, for 4 out of 5 times it connected a signal almost instantly, which is really good, and it was also relatively accurate. It's not exactly on the corner in the beginning, but it's quite close, and as you can see, one time it took a bit of time to acquire the signal, but overall this is looking quite okay. And then if we go along the ride, we see that the consistency between the signals is quite okay. If we zoom out a bit, we see that the signals overlap quite well, especially for this first part right here. Now here there was actually some construction, so 2 rides are going to the right and 2 to the left. But generally, if we then go on and along the ride, we see that the agreement between the different rides is really good. I'm quite satisfied with this. I think it's close to the performance of Garmin, for instance, especially right here we see quite a good agreement. If we zoom in, we see that all 5 of the rides overlap very well. Also on the corner right here, where I take quite a right angle on my corner, we see that the agreement is quite okay. It does seem to smooth the corner a bit, so they're a bit rounder than the ones I took in reality, but still overall this looks quite good. And then going along the right, it mostly looks quite okay. We only see in this moment right here that there's a bit of deviation between the signals. So some are a bit more to the left and they should be more or less on the right here. Still, looking at the full picture and also comparing it to other watches, I think it's doing quite well. I would say that it's close in performance to how Garmin watches perform on me. But look at some of the reviews I did of Garmin watches to see how you feel that Garmin watches compare to the Pace 3. But I do need to do a bit more testing to be sure of those results. But luckily I do already have a bit more testing. I also tested the watches cycling back from work. So let's take a look at that. So right here you can see the results for 4 times I cycled back from work. And I always started my ride right here in front of the building. And again, you can see that the signals were acquired quite quickly. Again, there's a bit of deviation about where it had the first signal, but overall the signal is acquired quite quickly. Then if we look at the consistency between the rides, this again looks quite good. Now for one of these rides, I did go somewhere else, so the signal deviates quite quickly, but this is because I had a different destination, not because of a problem with the watch. So if we go along the ride, we see they generally agree very well. There's quite a good consistency, though still a bit of deviation, but overall this is better than most of the watches out there. Then if we go along the ride, we do see a bit more deviation in this area. This is where more watches tend to struggle, at least a little bit. Also right here, many watches tend to struggle, and the Pace 3 isn't doing that terrible right there. Though this signal right here, for instance, does show quite a significant deviation. It's going through some buildings as well. So I'm not sure what to make of that. Overall, the performance of the Pace 3 seems to be quite good. We can also see that right here where the two signals overlap quite well. Though there are a few moments with a bit more deviation. You can also see that right here, for instance, and also right here. Generally though, compared to most other watches out there, the Pace 3 does seem to be performing better. It might be slightly worse than some Garmin devices, which are the top contenders in my testing. The deviation is not that big and more testing is needed to say anything for sure. And I expect and hope that this also translates to a good accuracy when running outside. But of course, this is something I need to test in the future. So the GPS tracking performance of the Pace 3 is quite good. It's not that far off in performance from some of the better Garmin devices. So if tracking your run or cycling route is most important to you, the Coros Pace 3 is likely a solid choice. Therefore, overall, I'd give the GPS tracking 4 out of 5 stars. Now finally, let's look at the sleep stage tracking of the Pace 3. Now it's become more and more accepted over the last few years that good sleep quality is potentially just as important for improving your performance in sports and your health span as training itself. And tracking your sleep can potentially help you improve it. Now how you can actually use sleep information to improve your sleep is an entirely different discussion and question, which I might address in a future video. However, in this video, we're going to focus on the sleep stage tracking performance of the Coros Pace 3. Now, normally I would discuss this earlier in my video. However, I'm having some issues with the reference device I use. I usually compare watches to an EEG device called the Dream 2 that can actually measure my brainwaves and has been shown to be relatively reliable at sleep stage tracking. Now, I did collect 4 nights of data with both the Pace 3 and the EEG device. However, the servers of Dream are now offline and hopefully they will come back. However, in the end, I was only able to retrieve a single night of data from the EEG reference device. I still wanted to share these results with you since they give a very rough first impression. However, given that I only have 1 night of data and that in addition it's an imperfect reference, I do need to emphasize you should take these results with a very large grain of salt. Now right here you can see an overview of the sleep test results. Now on top are the sleep stages as recorded by the EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Pace 3. Now for getting an overall impression of how well the Pace 3 performs, the Dream 2 as a reference should likely be good enough. However, the gold standard would of course be polysomnography. Now each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 was predicted as each sleep stage by the Pace 3. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. Now, first of all, we see that only about 35% of what was deep sleep according to the EEG device was also predicted as deep sleep by the Pace 3, so that's quite little. Actually, a much larger percentage of what was deep sleep according to the Dream 2 for this night was predicted as light sleep by the Pace 3 at about 60%, so almost double the percentage we saw for where they agreed. Now, looking at the night itself will help us understand that even better, and here you can see those results. On top, we have the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 EEG headband, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom, we have a similar plot, but now for the Pace 3. And right here in purple are marked the deep sleep as recorded by the Dream 2 EEG headband. And as you can see, there's generally a marginal agreement between the deep sleep as detected by the EEG device and the Pace 3. There's some overlap here, so as we also saw based on the percentages, about 1/3 of what the EEG device detected as deep sleep was also detected as deep sleep by the Pace 3, but the Pace 3 detected more deep sleep later on in the night, so in the middle right here, but also near the end. And I know based on my normal sleep pattern, so I've done about 90 polysomnography measurements on myself, so the professional sleep measurements, and I tend to have only 1 or 2 deep sleep segments in the beginning of the night and basically no deep sleep in the second half of the night. So these patterns by the Pace 3 are also not very like my normal patterns. Now, light sleep agreement is okay at best at 62%. So 62% of what the EEG device said was light sleep was also said to be light sleep by the Pace 3. And if they did disagree, this is mostly with the Pace 3 detecting this as deep sleep instead. Now, REM sleep agreement was the worst out of all the sleep stages, but again, we're just looking at one night, so take it with a grain of salt. Though still, as a first impression, this isn't that good, and almost double that was predicted as being light sleep instead. So we see that both for what the EEG device detected as deep sleep, light sleep, and REM sleep, the Pace 3 tends to detect about 60% of that as being light sleep. So this is actually not looking that great. The one positive thing is that it does tend to go in the right direction. So we see 35% deep sleep here, and these percentages here are lower. And we also see 31% REM sleep here, and the rest of the percentages are also lower. But it's not that great, honestly. And we can see that in a different way if you look at the night itself. So here I mark the REM sleep as detected by the EEG device in red. And as you can see, again, there's a marginal agreement between the EEG device and the Pace 3. Here in the beginning, some of the segments agree, so this segment right here is also somewhat detected. The same goes for this segment and maybe even this segment and this segment. So the location of the REM sleep actually doesn't agree too poorly between the EEG device and the Pace 3. It's just the duration of those segments is a bit different between the Pace 3 and the EEG, where at least for this one single night, which again isn't enough to draw any definitive conclusions, we see that the Pace 3 detects less REM sleep. So the red segments right here of the Pace 3 are much smaller than those detected by the EEG device. But as I said, the positions of the segments somewhat seem to match, so that's a good sign. Now, awake time detection was pretty okay at a 58% agreement with the EEG device, and most confusion was with light sleep. And this makes sense, of course, as light sleep is the closest sleep stage to being awake. And we can also see that quite well if you look at the individual night. So I marked the awake moments as detected by the EEG device in green right here. And as you can see, it detected a bunch of awake moments here near the end of the night and 2 during the night. Now, these same 2 awake moments right here were also detected by the Pace 3, so that is quite good. And also near the end of the night right here, we see quite a decent agreement between both devices. The Pace 3 just tended to detect a few more awake moments, so we see 4 more awake moments during the night that were not detected by the EEG device. So the Pace 3 might just be a tiny bit more sensitive. Still, overall, this doesn't look bad. So awake detection, as far as we can see based on a single night, appears to be somewhat reliable for the Pace 3. So overall, this honestly doesn't look that amazing, though again, this is only based on a single night with an imperfect reference, so that grain of salt is really important to take. So that doesn't look too great for the Pace 3 in terms of sleep tracking. However, to put these results into context, we can compare the performance of the Coros Pace 3 to that of 40 other watches I tested previously. Now, this graph shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with the EEG device. On the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the 4 individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. So the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. Now, the watches marked in blue were actually tested against the polysomnography device, which is the gold standard in sleep stage tracking, and the results not marked in any color were based on my reference EEG device. Now, the results based on the EEG device and those based on the polysomnography device actually give very similar interpretations. Now, as you can see, the device devices with the best agreement so far were different Apple Watches. In this case, the Apple Watch Series 7, Series 8, the Apple Watch SE, and the Apple Watch Ultra. The H-Sleep Pod 3 actually also performed very well, and other good devices include different Fitbits, Whoop straps, and the Withings Sleep Analyzer, though all these agreements are not quite as good as those of the Apple Watches. And if we now plot the Pace 3 in the same plot, which is marked in red right here, you see it's not doing that great compared to other watches. Now again, this is based on a single night, so we cannot draw any real conclusions from this, but I just wanted to give you some perspective of how those results that we were just looking at compared to the results I got for other watches. But again, for the other watches, I generally have many more nights of data, so I would trust them much more than the results for the Pace 3. Still, based on this single night, I expected the chances that the Pace 3 is a really good performer aren't that great. So based on this admittedly limited test, the sleep stage tracking of the Coros Pace 3 doesn't seem that great. It does seem to be able to track when I fell asleep, when I woke up, and roughly when I had awake moments, but overall the sleep stages don't seem that reliable. Therefore, overall, I'd give the sleep stage tracking of the Coros Pace 3 between 2 and 2.5 out of 5 stars. Now, before I plunge into my final thoughts on the watch, it is essential to highlight a few of the constraints related to my testing methods. Now, first off, please be aware that tests were conducted only on myself, so the watch's performance may vary on other individuals. Aspects like your skin tone, sex, whether your arm is hairy or not, or even whether you have a wrist tattoo just might affect how the watch performs. Also, I just tested the watch with the current firmware for a limited number of days, and the sleep test I showed was not as reliable compared to my normal testing, so please don't rely too much on those results. That being said, my testing should paint a broad picture of the watch's overall performance, but just keep in mind there could be a little bit of variation, and I would also recommend watching other reviewers like Chase the Summit, DC Rainmaker, Desfit, and Matt Legrand. Now, let's get to my final conclusions. First of all, also subjectively, I actually really enjoyed the experience of using the Coros Pace 3. And this is in part due to the light weight of the watch, which made it really comfortable to wear. The long battery life is also a pro, though design-wise it's not exactly my taste, but that's of course super subjective. But what is more important in terms of performance, the Pace 3 surprised me in a really positive way. The heart rate tracking in particular was better than I had expected, since it was quite good during indoor and outdoor cycling, and it appears to be really good for running. The only thing it didn't do well is tracking my heart rate during weightlifting. Now, the GPS or location tracking also appears to be rather good, which is likely important to many of you. Now, the sleep stage tracking, on the other hand, did not leave the best impression, at least based on my limited test, and I would only use it for tracking my total time asleep and tracking when I fell asleep and when I woke up. Therefore, overall, I'd give the Pace 3 between, I would say, 3.5 and 4 stars out of 5. However, given that it's relatively affordable for this type of watch, I'm tempted to round it up to 4 stars. Now, if you do decide to get a Coros Pace 3, a Garmin watch, a Whoop strap, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, and at the same time you want to support this channel, there are different affiliate and non-affiliate links in the description below that do not cost you any extra, and some even provide a discount. Now, given that you watched this whole video on the Coros Pace 3, you might also be interested in some more detailed Garmin watch testing, which you can find right here. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.